Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on research and programs in the war against poverty and the war against drugs. Yet despite this massive expenditure, little or no improvement has resulted. Is there no solution? Haven't all the complex proposals failed? Well, the Heritage Foundation, in a recently published study, has found that hope lies right in our midst, in the practice of religion. Come join us on this episode of the St. Charles Forum as we discuss this new study.
The Eternal Word Television Network presents the St. Charles Forum from St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Welcome to the St. Charles Forum. We're very privileged to have with us today Patrick Fagan, a senior policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and author of the study, Why Religion Matters, the Impact of Religious Practice on Social Stability. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you, John.
We're also very pleased to have with us someone from another public policy research institute, Dr. Robert Royal, who's Vice President for Research at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Robert, glad to have you with us. Gentlemen, both of you are in Washington. You live and work there. There you can see what's actually going on in this nation. Pat, would you say we're in trouble? Is this nation facing a social crisis?
Without a doubt, in deep trouble and getting worse. Just in human terms, the prognosis doesn't look good.
Now, I've heard of something called economic indicators that tells us how we're doing economically as a country, what the interest rate is, what the savings rate is, what the balance of trade is, and so forth. I understand that there's something that's come out of Washington known as cultural indicators that tells us how we're doing as a culture.
That's right. Bill Bennett, the former drug czar and Secretary of Education, put together key indicators of how we're doing on the social, cultural, family, education end. And again, just a quick way to sum it up, they're all tending down.
Give me an idea of an indicator, a cultural indicator.
I think one of the key ones is marriage or out-of-wedlock births, flip side of the same thing. And our out-of-wedlock births is just climbing steadily, continually upwards, which means more and more children are being born normally without their fathers there, without married love to sustain them. Mm-hmm. That's one of the key ones.
Mm-hmm. Bob, does your center also find these kind of dismal social statistics?
Oh yeah, and it's much worse than many of us think. We've actually grown accustomed to the idea that these high levels of social pathologies are normal. If you look at this historically, we're in an unprecedented situation. Gertrude Himmelfarb, a scholar who's also now living in Washington, did a book last year called The Demoralization of Society, which was actually about the Victorian age, not about our time. And most people think of the Victorian age as an age of high morality and social stability, but in point of fact, in the early Victorian age, there was a kind of a boomlet in social pathologies where illegitimacy went up from something like 3%, where it had always historically been, to 6 or 7%, and everyone was horrified, both church people and secular people in Victorian society, and they got together and they actually were able to reverse this social decay.
Now, how did they do that?
Well, they went into poor areas, they counseled poor women, they tried to get people who were involved in drugs and alcohol abuse, and this is the whole Dickens picture that we read in those novels. And actually what they were able to do was take the poorer areas of London and make them the least, the areas with the least social pathology, the least drug use, the least illegitimacy. But it's worth pointing out that they were terrified when their illegitimacy rate was at 6 and 7%. In the United States right now we have, and I'll defer to Pat perhaps on this, but we have roughly a black illegitimacy rate that's 2/3, 67%, a white illegitimacy rate that's 22 or 23% for a general average of about 31, 32%. So we are enormously, astronomically beyond what the Victorians were just horrified and thought was the end of their civilization.
Well, if we've got, let's say, 30% of the children in this country every year being born out of wedlock, which is really a staggering number, who's looking after them? I mean, if they're born out of wedlock, there's no father, right, at home? I mean,
That's right.
How are these children being cared for?
Well, by the mothers normally. On top of that, actually, the mothers, If you go back to the Victorian era, in England, you still had extended family around and you had a lot of community. So there were even more buffers there for aunts, uncles, grandparents. But increasingly, as all of us know, we're further away from our parents and from our aunts and uncles. Most of us live more in isolated nuclear families. So the mother normally is the one who has a huge strain on her.
But she doesn't have the resources to do it. Where are the resources coming from?
Well, from herself. But a lot, this is what happens then actually, is that the strain is too much for more, not all. Actually, the vast majority actually of single mothers do a very good job. But there's an increasing proportion who can't handle it. Nature's not designed that way. And its effects actually are worst on the boys. Because if you look at the development of a boy, he's got to achieve two bondings. First to his mother, who gives him his sense of personness, and then to his father, who gives him his maleness. The girl only has to do one bonding, to the mother. Now, I'm not saying that the father's role isn't important, it is. But as a result, if you take like in our inner cities now, we have boys who don't know their father, their grandfather, their great-grandfather, sometimes even their great-great-grandfather. 4 generations of no masculinity. And these men then become the fathers of the next generation, unanchored and all the rest.
And this has its effect on crime, I'm sure.
Yeah, we can be sure that this is a kind of a, I want to be clear, I don't believe in social determinism. I always hope that there are ways that people may be able to find their way out of this.
Well, you pointed out that the Victorians found a way out of their dilemma.
And certainly there are any number of interventions that might be tried. But just simply, if we look at this in purely naturalistic terms, we know that there are already in the pipeline large cohorts of men who have never been made full men by being in contact with mature men, been brought in, been kind of put through rites of passage, whereby they become productive members of the community. And in fact, what we can see is that there are going to be large bumps. We've had a temporary downturn in crime in most of the cities in the country, but we can pretty much predict, insofar as statistics are useful in situations like this, that we're going to see an enormous crime wave. Probably on top of that, there will be a further increase in this illegitimacy rate, although it's already high. And with that, we get all the other accompaniments of that kind of family breakdown, which is poverty. It's not, you don't need to be Karl Marx to figure out why a poor 16-year-old girl who has a baby then ends up poor and that child ends up poor. These are very natural, easy to figure out conditions.
Well, the government has stepped in to help with a lot of these programs. I mean, we were talking earlier about, or made reference earlier to the war on poverty. I mean, haven't millions, indeed billions of tax dollars been spent to try to correct these problems?
Well, actually, the war on poverty has succeeded. Essentially, the poverty we have is the homeless type of poverty, which is a very different thing. These are people where government programs can't reach them. Material poverty is not a problem in this country. Our poor, if you look at the international surveys, their standard of living is middle class for the US of 30, 40 years ago, and for a lot of the rest of the countries of the world. So material poverty, the programs have succeeded. But nobody calls the war on poverty a success, because it has been a disaster in what has happened culturally to our poor. And essentially, the big way to sum it up is government came in as father, provider, and fathers were driven out. I'm going to make a rather radical statement.
You, Pat, radical statement?
Well, I was in HHS as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Social Services Policy.
Okay, wait, HHS?
Is the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, the 4th largest budget in the world.
In the world?
In the world. When there, I conducted a review with the staff of the effectiveness of social programs, not material programs, not health programs, but things like Head Start, sex education, all of the things are getting in on the social end. And it was to try and identify a couple that worked. Say, okay, let's learn from the ones that worked. With the staff, we came up with 0. You cannot find, government, actually, way to sum it up, government is incompetent in the nurturing area. And there isn't a single federal program that is succeeding.
Now, both you men are in Washington. Bob, would you tend to agree with that assessment?
Oh, yeah, I think that that's absolutely true.
In terms of the social policy.
Right, and I think what we really need to be clear about is that, as Pat says, materially speaking, even the American poor are in much better condition than most people around the world. But what Tocqueville once called the condition of the poor is quite another matter. To take another historical parallel, if you take our own period during the Depression, I mean, I wasn't alive during that time, but I've heard stories from my mother and father and from lots of other people, and I've since studied some of the data about it. We tend to, because we've accepted a kind of a materialistic or economic view of man, we tend to think that because people are poor, they are necessarily somehow going to be morally depraved. In point of fact, during the Depression, when families were still largely intact and a great deal of pressure was put on them, they didn't break. They tended to pull together more. There's rather good evidence that crime went down rather than went up during that period. So a society or a family can bear with a good deal of hardship if it has a core of morals, a core of character to be able to deal with it. We've actually put the thing the other way around, and it was a humane gesture to try to deal with these questions of poverty, particularly for the elderly who had largely worked during their whole lives and toward the end of their lives were in conditions of penury. But I think we want to keep clear that the real moral wealth of a nation, this is something that the American founders thought a great deal about. In fact, Pat quotes this in that very fine study that he did, that they really knew that the wealth and the power of a democratic republic like ours rests in the virtue of the people. And George Washington, in his farewell address, said rather famously that whatever the fancy educational system can do for certain peculiar minds, as he put it, the way that really most people get their formation in virtue and character and the ability to participate in society is through religion. And he said, both reason and experience alike forbid us to believe that popular virtue can continue long, absent religious principle. Mm-hmm. So they knew this. They knew that it was going to be a matter of what kind of character people had rather than physical wealth or education.
So you're both saying, and Pat, you've got a study to show it, and we're going to have to wind up this segment, but that it hasn't been the expenditures of all vast sums of money that has helped the problem. In fact, it's made the problem worse. Marriages are breaking down, high illegitimacy rate. I think the performance in our schools has dropped. That's another one of the cultural indicators. So it's not money. That's not going to solve the problem. And your study found what was the answer? In a word?
Faith, God.
The practice of religion?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And does this surprise, obviously it doesn't surprise Bob because he's just quoted George Washington to the effect that we could see this from very early on, that this is what would build the strength of a nation. Well, when we come back from this break, we're going to look into this study. This is a scientific study done with sociologists, right?
Summing up the research in the field. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the data will show us that we do have a place to turn. So we'll continue this discussion further when we come back after this break on St. Charles Forum.
The St. Charles Forum will return in a moment.
Welcome back to the St. Charles Forum as we discuss the positive role of religion in social stability. Gentlemen, the last segment we were talking about the cultural decline that we see today in American society. Bob mentioned that the Victorians had faced a problem like this in their own history, and they were able to come to grips with it and restore a high degree of social stability. Pat, your foundation in Washington did a study to see the impact of religion on social stability. Can you give us just a brief overview of its findings?
Alan Bergen, who's a famous research psychologist, in 1990 got the American Psychological Association Award for his lifetime of research. And the way he described it, said, in many areas, religion has a very good impact. However, in a lot, it's similar to nuclear energy. There's hardly...
How do you mean it does some good, but it's dangerous?
No, it's just massive in its power.
Oh, I see. It's massive in its power.
There are two variables in the social science that are increasingly have the huge impact for good. One is marriage, which is love. And the other is faith, which is love of God. They're the two big variables. And the practice of faith, particularly of a faith involving public worship, going to Mass on Sunday, going to church on Sunday, going to synagogue on Saturday or mosque on Saturday. It holds across religions that those people who honor God both in their private and in a public way have tremendous blessings going with it. Stability in marriage, avoidance of all these difficulties we're talking about, drug addiction, by and large, not everyone, obviously. Lots of sinners are
the church is there for sinners, right?
Yeah, it's a church of sinners and with some saints. But out of wedlock births, cohabitation before marriage, drug addiction, alcoholism, or the recovery from those, happiness in marriage, a sense of ethics, a sense of optimism, self-esteem, the big holy grail of the social scientists of the present. All of those things are massively aided by the practice of religion, and particularly of public worship of God.
So your study found that if people were religious, they were active in their religion, there was less likelihood of illegitimate births, less likelihood of drug addiction, less likelihood of divorce and the breakup of the marriage.
Less likelihood of crime.
Now, how do you prove something like this?
Well,
I mean, how do these sociologists do it? How do you prove something like the religious people in this country go to jail less?
Well, you take a survey. You spend a lot of money. The expensive part of Bill Bennett's dictum on social science, a complex, complicated way to prove the obvious, and then there's an expensive way. You take a survey. We have, for instance, we got one big survey going on that since the late 70s has been tracking about 30,000 people.
That's a big
national survey. Mm-hmm. And the same people who were between 14 and 21 then, they're now in their early to mid 30s. We've been tracking them all the way along. We didn't gather a lot of data on religious practice there, but enough to know what their parents were doing. And for instance, in that, we can see how many of them have ended up in jail, what their income is, how they're doing in their family life, and all of that. It's very clear there. The average income difference for this cohort is $7,000 a year difference between those who were raised in a family that went to church regularly each week and those who didn't.
And now, which one's making the more money?
Those who went to church.
No kidding.
There's one of the famous studies done in the mid 80s by a Harvard professor, National Bureau of Economic Research, here actually in Philadelphia, did inner city poverty tract surveys and found that the kids who made it out of poverty, one of the key indicators was they and their parents went to church regularly. What I found amazing was that no other social scientist has since replicated that. That hasn't been published. I haven't come across another publication. Here we are all talking about welfare, all concerned about moving people out of poverty. Somebody finds almost like the equivalent of a cure for cancer, and everybody else just stays away from it.
Bob, you've read the study, have you?
Yeah.
And in terms of your own researches, have they tended to collaborate?
Yeah, I think it confirms it, and I'd like to even push the point further. I mean, there's a danger in looking at studies like this, in taking a pragmatic approach and recommending to people, well, if you go to church on Sunday, that
you get $7,000.
You don't only get pie in the sky, you get pie on Friday in your paycheck as well. I mean, it may be true that there are those positive effects, but as we know, we should also do the right thing, even if we don't get these positive effects. But it's curious, as Pat points out, that we're surprised at this. Even we are somewhat surprised that there are these material benefits. And I think it's because largely we've been hypnotized by the social scientists. Excuse me, Pat, I'm not a social scientist. Sure. But we've been hypnotized to believe that the only real forces in the world are physical forces and social forces, and people are determined and driven by economic factors. When in point of fact, people who have a religious vision of the world know that human persons are something entirely other than that, and that human beings can transcend their circumstances. Now, if you look around the culture, who else teaches that human beings have freedom? They have an intellect that enables them to judge between what's good and evil, and even in very difficult situation, with God's grace, to choose what's right. There's no place. You're not going to hear this from our public schools. You're not going to hear them, God knows, from the universities, alas, sometimes even in our Catholic universities. You're not going to hear this from politicians. You don't hear it from the media because there are all sorts of political reasons why that's not a particularly good argument to make. So the one place that you go to and you find the statement that you have the capacity to know what's right and wrong in every circumstance, no matter how difficult, and do something about it, is in the religious bodies that are serious religious bodies. So
that is a general religious phenomenon, right? I mean, as you say, whether you're dealing with Christians or Muslims or Jews, they teach that
it's the common horizon in which the biblical faiths tend to operate. And an interesting study that Joseph Califano's center up at Columbia just did not long ago, there's a center there called CASA, Center for Alcohol and Substance Abuse. I think
now, Joseph Califano's a familiar name.
He's the former Secretary of Health and Human Services, I think, back in the Carter administration.
Yes.
So he's a Democrat. Califano came out with a study that, and he is no advocate of the Christian coalition or the religious right, and their study has shown that for alcohol and substance abuse, religious-based programs do far better than any other type of program. It's the old story of the Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12-step program, that if you tell people, yes, that you recognize what's wrong, maybe you can't do anything about it because you're addicted or your will is weak, but if you invoke a higher power and say, I know that I want to do this, help me do it, something can change in people's lives. And the evidence is incontrovertible that those types of programs have been the most successful across the board.
Now, we've talked about substance abuse and addiction, and religion helps people out of that. We've talked about productivity and efficiency and greater income coming from people who practice religion. What about the family breakdown? That's been one of the greatest concerns that we're faced with in this country right now. What kind of role does religion play there?
On the positive side, people who go to church regularly tend to marry and have stable marriages. Those who don't go to church regularly, their family life is much more likely to break at some stage. Men who go to church regularly tend to be faithful to their wives. Men who don't tend to switch partners quite a lot. Huge difference there. Children whose parents go to church tend not to get involved in premarital sex. So the out-of-wedlock births are a lot less. On almost every factor, look at it from any angle, either the breakup or the stability of marriage and family correlates with either the attendance at church or the absence of it.
Now, you also referred in your report to something called, see if I get the phrase right, extrinsic religion and intrinsic religion. And there was a difference between those two in the outcome. Now, first of all, what's extrinsic and intrinsic religion?
It comes back to something Bob was talking about there. Avoid religion for utilitarian reasons, because actually you won't get the benefits. Instead, actually you get a lot of pain. Intrinsic religion is a social science term for people really worshiping God for God's own sake. Because he is there, because he is the creator, because it is the right thing to do, because you are a creature. You're doing it for really intrinsic good reasons. Extrinsic practice is a social science term. You're doing it for other reasons. You join a particular church because it's the church to join if you want to be seen and you're a social climber, or because of the good things that sometimes come with it, the companionship or something like that. You're not doing it for God's sake, you're doing it for the benefit.
How do sociologists find that out? I mean, it's a little hard. It's not like putting a blood pressure machine on somebody's arm and finding out what their blood pressure is. How do you find out if somebody's practicing extrinsic or intrinsic religion?
Well, actually, this is one of the nice things. I think the social sciences are very useful when they are a pursuit of the truth. They only get partial truths, but they do it. And there are ways, questions you can ask. This is very much a psychology questionnaire by which you can find out, for instance, we know in relationships with people, we can find out whether somebody is involved in a relationship for intrinsic reasons, like because of friendship. Or is it just to manipulate? If I am a friend of yours, John, I'd get on this show often, huh? Well, that would be an extrinsic reason. And you wouldn't like it, and people wouldn't like me if I tried to develop a friendship for those reasons. Now, that's the same
So
here.
it's the kinds of questions that are
Kinds of
asked in
questions.
these
You can
forums.
flush that out,
Okay,
yeah.
But also, I think that we're now getting to a point in American society where the social prestige of going to church is a lot less than it once was. The president still more or less has to be a religious figure, but very few other people do. And I think that there may be another category in here, Pat, that you guys ought to pursue it at a certain point, because there's a... I notice with a lot of people, and this is just anecdotal, that there are a number of people who make their families sort of their religion. I mean, I've actually had a number of people tell me this, and almost uniformly they've had a bad experience. There's no kind of recognition of an external, transcendent God that we're all kind of submitted to. It's much more an internal looking type of religion. And I've known a number of families that have actually broken up because of those circumstances. In any case, I think that the figures now that just reflect raw attendance at church really do reflect a much greater commitment than they might have in the past. In the past, there was kind of this social pressure to be seen in church on a Sunday.
There's not as much social prestige
now,
associated with it anymore.
Now to get up on a Sunday morning and go to a church or to a temple, it means it's a real commitment. Otherwise, you might as well have brunch with a family and have a nice day doing some sort of recreation.
Well, Pat, what's been the response to this report?
Very good, very good. I think, in a way, I think it's like confirming common sense for those who are religious worshipers, those who worship God. And for a lot of people, actually, the other thing is, it is so powerful. And
it is so powerful in our society because it's a sociological study.
Sorry, I meant like the practice of faith is so powerful.
Oh, I see.
The data is so convincing.
Yeah.
It's incontrovertible. Actually, nobody, and for non-believers, the way I put it, look, even if you're a person of no religious faith, and you are concerned about all these social programs, just look at the data, and you will come to the conclusion, if you're a person of goodwill, that even though I may not be a believer, it is good for society that we have many believers.
Now, has that generally happened? Has that been the reaction to this?
Well, I was on National Public Radio. They were interested in this. The press has been very good. The Washington Post carried a magnificent piece on it, a full page, which was almost a first for us at Heritage. They don't tend to.
And with your picture right on the front page.
So there has been a very good response to it. I do think actually there's a hunger out there now. People know we are in deep trouble, and they know that our secular efforts have failed.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to look at some more of the responses to this when we come back after this break on the St. Charles Forum.
Stay tuned. The St. Charles Forum will return in just a moment.
Welcome back to the St. Charles Forum as we discuss the positive impact in society of religious practices. And Pat's foundation in Washington did a study, a sociological study, that found from the data that religion is a positive influence in correcting many social ills. If that's the case, Patrick and Bob, then I suspect that the ruling elite in this country, the cultural elite, the editorial writers of our major newspapers, the educators, the jurists, the psychiatrists, are probably out there advocating a greater practice of religion. I mean, Bob, has this been the general response to findings like this?
I don't think that's been the general response, and I wouldn't expect it to be anytime soon. Although there are signs that people are beginning to recognize the substantial contribution that religion makes. I think somebody joked, maybe it was Bill Bennett, that if you were walking down a dark urban street at night and you saw a bunch of threatening kids walking toward you, would it make any difference in your attitude toward them if you knew they were coming from a Bible study? And quite clearly it would. I think one of the things we just have to recognize that there is a long-term historical bias against religion in, let's say, public Western life. Certainly the American founding was not an anti-religious founding, but there was a kind of I think an optimistic Enlightenment assumption that all rational people believed basically the same things. Thomas Jefferson once said in a a rather foolish moment for him because he was a rather wise man. Otherwise, he once said, "What do I care if my neighbor believes in no God or 20 gods? It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." Well, I think lots of us can say that in 1996 in the United States, lots of people are having their pockets picked and their legs broken because people don't believe in gods or believe in the wrong gods. Or it's not quite as optimistic an environment that we find ourselves in. Now, that said, there is, it's not only that there's an optimistic kind of rationalism, there has also been a deep prejudice against religiosity, as if it's this Freudian notion that it's a wish fulfillment, it's a fantasy, it's something that doesn't have any basis in reality. As I was saying earlier, I really think that the way to explain the success that religion has, other than the fact that God gives us graces when we turn to Him, is that it is just simply and literally true that the religious anthropology, that the Christian anthropology of a human person as a free person with an intellect who can choose good and evil and can be empowered to do that by recognizing his or her place in the universe, has an enormous effect on people.
Mm-hmm. Pat, there was a study done that showed that most people involved in the media were not practitioners of religion. And so obviously, I suppose this is going to have an impact too on the way in which they respond to studies like yours.
Yes, I would think so. But again, a bit like Bob said, changes are beginning there. There's an inquiry. In the last year, there have been a lot of programs compared to the past. A lot of programs looking at the benefits of religion.
Looking at the positive role of religion.
Yeah, actually, and I suspect actually that in journalism, almost more than anywhere else, is this openness to this. Among academics and in the profession, psychiatry, psychology, I think there's more resistance. Historically, there has been, but maybe that's beginning to change. But like Bob said, I agree, I wouldn't expect that in any great turnaround overnight.
I want to ask you something. I know you have a psychology background as well. There's something called the DSM.
The DSM, yes, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's the reference book that psychotherapists, psychiatrists, psychologists use in diagnosing the condition of a person. Are you schizophrenic? Are you psychotic? Are you depressed? Are you manic depressive? All those sort of things. So the
big volume, and they kind of look up the traits.
It's a summary of the best of the research that we have. Mm-hmm. And
now, how has it dealt with religion in the past?
In the past, very negatively, but good news. It has changed in its latest edition. And that's really the work, as a result of the work of good social scientists. Dr. David Larson, who's done a huge amount of work here, has actually effected that change. And for instance, the MMPI was Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It's about 400 questions. And you go down at yes, no, all the way down through it. And it's very accurate in diagnosing the mental state of people. But it had a bias against religion. Because any time one answered a question the way a religious person would, it essentially affected your score negatively. Now, they have changed that, which is good. Again, when that was pointed out, they've changed it. It isn't that they've become advocates of religion, but they've become less hostile. So that's some of the good.
So there has been some positive effects coming out of these discoveries.
Yeah.
Bob, your center in Washington is called the Ethics in Public Policy Center. It tries to affect public policy, and does it? I mean, I'm asking you tell our viewers a little bit about the center.
I would never say we don't affect public policy. We were founded a long time ago precisely because we thought that there was a loss of this connection between ethics and the public realm. And most people recognize that politics, although politics is not strictly speaking morals, that it is rooted in a deep sense of what the world is like, what human beings are like, how people should order their
If it's not rooted in morality, it's not going to be good politics.
Yeah, and then it becomes a kind of pragmatics, who can get a majority to work his will. We find actually that we get a great deal of response to the kind of things that we say, that there's a great hunger out there for people who instinctively know that the kinds of things that made the country go, that enable it to continue, that enable it to prosper, that make their own lives meaningful, even if temporarily they're out of work or they're not doing as well financially as they might want to, that those things are really quite something different than is usually talked about at the public level. Now, I think it's very interesting that the rhetoric has changed in politics. It's changed much more than it has, say, on university campuses. So you get both Democrats and Republicans speaking in very favorable terms of religion, of morality, of responsibility. Alas, we don't see a great deal of transmission of that recognition into the actual public policy decisions that need to be made. We know as well as we can know anything at all, that, for example, that the welfare system has to be changed, unless we intend to just perpetuate this engine which in a way subsidizes illegitimacy, subsidizes family breakdown, and leads to many of the pathologies that we see all around us. So there's the conceptual recognition of it. It has a political cachet. It's very popular with the people right now to talk in these terms. But let's hope that in the next couple sessions of the Congress, we'll begin to see that translate into action.
But it still seems to me, though, that the more positive role of religion in promoting the social good. We're all religious people, so we've known in our gut all along that this is true. We now have sociological studies that prove it statistically. And yet, if I look around me here in the United States, there still seems to be more opposition to religious expression in the public realm than there is, for example, from what I know of people going over there and living there, than there is in the former Soviet Union. That you can have religion taught in the schools, actually, in the public schools in Russia. Prayers are being said in many of the East European countries that had before been under the Soviet hegemony. That tax monies are going to support religious schools. I mean, Muslim, Catholic, Jewish, Protestant schools. What's this resistance, Pat? Why does it still seem to be so strong here in the United States?
Well, I would think actually the dominant ethos in the States is still this sort of post-Enlightenment agnosticism. It's no longer a hope and reason. But the power elites in the media and in academia, by and large, don't believe in God, or at least it isn't reflected in their work. And they still control a huge amount of the levers of power. For instance, like in the research area, the two strongest variables in the social sciences, I think, are marriage and religion. And yet they are constantly avoided in the social science. Not constantly, but massively avoided. There's like a denial of, well, that may be okay over there, but that really isn't where we ought to be heading.
Well, one thing that strikes me is that both of those things that you just mentioned, it just struck me now, are viewed in our society as being intensely personal, and don't belong in the public realm whatsoever. But even when marriage isn't even viewed anymore as a social or public institution. It's a matter of a private, personal arrangement between two people.
Well, that's the radical individualism of the United States that was there in its nascent form always, and I think has now gone to its nth expression almost. And the next stage actually is collapse. That's what's happened in the Soviet Union. The power elites of the Soviet Union, their experiment has totally failed, and people realize it. There's no authority there, so people are so hungry over there, they literally turn to God.
Lest we leave the viewers with too pessimistic a view, let me just point out another angle to this. It's true that the elites in the United States, every survey that's been done, say, of the people in Hollywood or in the media or in academia, they're almost the mirror image of the American populace. If the American people almost believe in God, and say about 90% of American people believe in God, 10% are either agnostic or atheistic. If you go out to Hollywood, you get the mirror image. Only 10% believe and 90% don't believe. And in many other elite fields, you get more or less the same results. Now, what that means is around the world, people get the wrong impression of America because they read American books, they see American television, they see American movies. And when you get foreigners who come here, and I speak to people all the time, I'm sure you do too, Pat, down in Washington, they're amazed because they also know that there is a certain idealism in America. In fact, many of them think that this is the only country in which there still does exist idealism, that there isn't a cynicism about politics and about public life.
In fact, I mean, just adding to what you're saying here and carrying it along, I mean, you pointed out to me before that we probably have the highest incidence of people going to church, practicing religion of any one of the Western countries.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's an odd, though, kind of dynamic that America has this idealism that is a non-official idealism. Now, all of us can probably come up with proposals that we think might help to improve the situation. Maybe some of us would like school vouchers, other of us might want another approach. But in a way, we've been tried by fire. In fact, I know people who claim that the worst thing that could happen to, say, Catholic schools would be school vouchers, because Catholic schools have succeeded, they think, precisely because there's no money. No one goes to teaching at Catholic school out of the desire to make a career. I mean, but all you can do is do it out of love of God and love for the kids. And as a result, they work against all odds, on a shoestring budget and in the interstices of the society. And if you gave them 4 times the amount of money, tomorrow they'd be just like the NEA-run schools and the public schools. And maybe that's true. Now, what that means about what we should do about the public rhetoric, though, I think is a different thing. And I think those of us who know that religiosity is good, not only for us personally, but for the nation as a whole, ought not to be very shy about saying that. And I think that studies like the thing that Pat has done, and I think we need a raft of studies like this, and they're beginning to appear now because people are so desperate. I mean, we do feel like we're very near dissolution in a lot of ways. And I think that much of the economic anxiety that some people feel is actually more based on moral and cultural worries than on physical survival, because we're going to survive physically, barring some sort of disaster in the near future. But this cultural thing is something that I think we really need to raise up to an even higher visibility than we have.
So, Pat, you see the same sort of phenomenon where you've got really a large mass of the American people, devout, practicing, but those that control the way in which our social life articulates, expresses itself, not open to those same values.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and on that point, we'll conclude this segment and finish our discussion after we come back after this break.
Stay tuned. The St. Charles Forum will return in just a moment.
Welcome back to St. Charles Forum as we discuss the positive social impact of the practice of religion. Pat, there's one thing that bothered me a little bit when I read the study. And I was very much encouraged by the study because it did show that religion's good for you, in a word, in many different ways. It's good for individuals, good for society. But what do we do with the family through no fault of their own, may be suffering, may be in poverty, that someone may be ill? Does this mean that God's not blessing them? Would there be the danger of our developing a kind of self-righteousness in the practice of religion because a given family or a given segment of our society doesn't seem to be enjoying these positive benefits that come from the practice of religion? How do you deal with something like that?
Well, the answer actually is to go back to God to find the answer. Don't go to the social sciences.
Good.
Mm-hmm. And in that, the Christian faith and the Church's teaching is very clear that God sometimes blesses people with heavy crosses, and it is a blessing. But then He gives the strength to go with it, and it's at the Last Judgment we will see the value of that blessing. So it doesn't, I totally agree. Like this, it all comes back, if you take a utilitarian view, even within oneself and in one's relationship to God, that if I don't make $1 million, I'm not holy. Oh, that's crazy, obviously. Or if I'm in bad health, that God isn't blessing me. As a matter of fact, a number of the saints have said, blessed be suffering, embrace suffering because it is the cross. That is the ultimate paradox of Christianity.
And of course there too, then you see again now a positive influence of religion, because then these people are not going to be tempted toward suicide or despair, and we're going to be able to maintain a sense of self-esteem.
One of the blessings that will always be there for the person of faith is ultimately an inner peace, no matter how bad conditions get, because they know they're sons of God, and that God is taking care of them, even despite what the externals look like. So the inner mental health, leave aside the psychiatric, biological sort of stuff. But the person who is close to God is going to have joy. Like the gifts of the Holy Spirit aren't bought, they're given.
And that's right, and they're not going to wind up on, the effects of them can show up on a sociological study, but as I say, they can't be bought. They're gifts from God. Yeah, that's right.
Now, I usually think of this in two biblical categories, that there are two ways in which the church functions. One is a priestly function, whereby it blesses and brings forth bounty in the society. And then there's a prophetic function that's over and against whatever society it happens to be in, because that society will never be perfect. It'll allow people to fall by the wayside. Some people, there have been estimates that probably in every society, something like 6 to 10% of the population is just unable to cope, whether physically, mentally, for whatever reason. So there's always going to be this dimension that has to be dealt with. We are not Calvinists. We are not going to think that simply because we have a holy society, everything is going to turn out okay. And I think that there's another danger, and maybe it's because I live in Washington that I particularly worry about this, but I think of the remark of the famous historian Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, who once said about the religions in the late Roman Empire that to the people they were all equally true. To the philosophers, they were all equally false. And to the politicians, they were all equally useful. Now, while we do want to have a useful religion that gives us an orderly society, one that is caring for people who fall by the wayside in one way or another, that has a moral vision for itself around the world, we don't want to take this material, which is quite good, and subordinate it simply to our politics. America is, by world standards, a very good country, but it is not the kingdom of God. And I think we have constantly to go back to this notion of, yes, there's this priestly side to what we do. We do want to support what is good in the society. We want to make it better. We want to extend it to more people. But we also have to maintain that prophetic dimension that may cause us at times to have to speak very seriously, both to the country internally and what it does and externally.
Well, that was another question that arose too. Whether it made any difference what religion you practiced, or just so it was religion. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of religion. Some religions advocate polygamy. I mean, the Mormons officially can embrace a polygamy and still think it's part of their system, but legally they're not allowed to do so in this country. Other religions have practices that frankly, Catholics and most Christians would find repugnant. How do you? Is it just any religion that's to be practiced?
No, I'm not saying that. But again, you've got, if we're dealing with social science data, here you've got to almost switch hats. And social sciences are only a sub-part of the whole picture of truth. And they can never claim but to illuminate a certain facet and never give you the whole. So that said, one of the striking things to me so far in the data for the United States is that those people who honor God by worshiping Him regularly, God seems to take very good care of all of His children who, even if they haven't got the full truth, are going towards Him. He seems to bless all. And that makes sense. Huh? That a father take care of his children who come to him.
And as He wants to draw them ever closer to Him and to His truth, that they'll be assisted along the way. I mean, the more truth they embrace, the greater the benefits.
One of the interesting, actually, there's a piece of research that even dug into some aspect of that. If you take black Protestants, who by and large are Baptists. Now, the Baptist Church permits divorce. White Catholics, the Catholic Church doesn't permit divorce. But the divorce rate among black Baptists who go to church weekly and white Catholics who go to church weekly is pretty similar and extraordinarily low.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Very good.
God gives His grace. Now, I'm not a theologian, and but it's
There's evidence there that the God's blessing.
Now there is
blessing them
evidence.
both.
I'm quite sure, but I have not seen any research. The social science research hasn't dug into this. I'm quite sure if you started to take, we say, devout people of different faiths, where the doctrine of the different faiths would lead to different things, that yes, I'm sure you would begin to see differences. But overall, what the data shows is that God takes care of those who come to Him.
Okay, now what are we going to do with this data? I mean, here we have a country in moral decline. We have a country in crisis. We have the tools of the social sciences showing us that one of the ways out of this dilemma is the practice of religion. How does that translate into public policy proposals?
Well, I think one of the initial things we need to do is to begin to invoke much more seriously the old Catholic social principle of subsidiarity. We know that for a very long time in this country, we have, quite contrary to our constitutional founding and traditions, allowed a great deal of power to be concentrated in Washington, where we live, and see agencies grow and grow and grow.
Just say very briefly what the principle of subsidiarity is.
Subsidiarity is a principle first formally stated in Quadragesimo Anno in 1931, saying that the level of level of government, or the level of an institution that tries to deal with a problem, should be the one that's closest to it if it's capable of dealing with it. So in other words, you don't call in the local police to get your 6-year-old to eat the cereal in the morning. I mean, that's what the family is there for, and you're there to discipline it. There are other levels. Some of them involve government, some of them don't involve government, but there should be a kind of an articulation in a society, and a good society does not invest too much power at the top, which is a tyranny. It does not allow too much power to just simply be held randomly, which is chaos. But I think we've drifted in this country so much to assuming that the federal government solves all these problems for us. I don't think this is simply a conservative insight. I think that it's something that a lot of liberals also feel right now, Democrats, Republicans, independents. At least as a start, and I think this is only a start, the idea of returning some powers back to the states is a beginning. Very concretely, I think a lot of the problem could be solved if there were real community democratic governance over certain institutions like local schools. I think most parents who send their children to public schools right now feel that they have their church here that's helping them out. They are trying to do the right thing with their kids. They're working and trying to do the right thing. And the school, though, is something quite different. I mean, we all are reading stories about, a guidance counselor gives a girl an address of an abortion clinic to go to, or the schools tend to regard themselves as an oversight for the family. Is the family being too repressive or disciplining too hard? There's a way in which those public schools, which used to be an expression of the community, have actually almost become kind of an alien presence in the community. And I think if we took back some institutions like that, some of these institutions might not look the way I would want them to look, because certain areas, the public school would have a certain population around them and would have a certain character. But I think unless we have that democratic governance of the people, by the people who are actually having to deal with this thing on a daily basis, and that's what subsidiarity in those instances.
Okay, so you're saying then that those more local institutions will come to be more infused with the spirit of religion, because the people controlling them are the ones that are filled with the spirit of religion.
And we had a time in America where local institutions, not only schools, but the town hall and the way Main Street looked, all these things were infused by the general popular sentiment.
And we've already seen that the general popular sentiment is one of religion, right?
Much more so than the elites would give us to believe.
Right, yeah. Pat, what would you suggest to be a societal response, and maybe even a governmental response to findings like these?
Playing off what Bob said, I think what we're realizing, there are areas where government is competent in the area of justice, protection of the country, army, economics, because it's always linked to government, the rules of the economy. But there are areas where it's incompetent, and we've been asking it to do it.
And that's where it better get out of the way, right?
Exactly.
Just move on.
We've made mistakes. They were well-intentioned. Let's pull back. The experiment has failed. What nurtures people? Look, if you look at children, and children are almost like the barometer of how we're doing as a society. Children do well when in a loving family. The loving family depends on loving marriage, and loving marriage depends on faith in God. So those things have to be re-anchored, which mean the child in the family in the marriage, and the marriage in the church, And in there, actually, the school is a linking part of that. So those three institutions really have to be bound together again at a very, very local level, because families are different and they like their schools run a little differently.
Well, it also takes care of the problem, because I was thinking earlier, if we have the government recognizing the benefit of religion and then trying to advance religion, well, that in a sense doesn't work either, because they can't endorse one religion or another.
They have no competence there.
Both of you are saying is the best thing the government can do here is to back off and let people live out their own religious beliefs and practices.
I would refine that just a little bit, though. I think that the federal government has to back off, because when you try to craft, this is a continent-sized nation. If you try to craft laws that are going to be as applicable in the South Bronx as they are in Texas, I often like to say, if you want a federal gun law, how do you write a federal gun law that covers handguns in the South Bronx? I mean, no one is going to want to allow handguns in the South Bronx. Or West Texas, where you send your kid to school and maybe there are rattlesnakes along the way and he takes a .22 to protect. This is just a very different set of circumstances. But government has to back off, but other structures have to intervene, because what we have come to call family values cannot exist in a vacuum. Family values are something that can be practiced internally in the family. They can be respected by government, but there also have to be public institutions that actually feed into them. The public school is one of them. Having a public library system is a nice thing that helps to provide education in the family. So I think that you need a different level of government and a different approach to these things that's very responsive to those local conditions. We're
going to have to be wrapping up, and I know Pat, too, in his study also told religious leaders to speak out more forcefully and with greater zeal. But people can get a copy of this study by writing the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Is that right?
That's right, or they can call 1-800-544-4843.
And on that note, we thank you very much for being with us, and thank you for being with us on this episode of the St. Charles Forum.